Hello, everyone. It's 3:55, and hopefully we'll start on time at 4. So thank you for joining in. We'll keep this on mute till the other participants and our resource person joins in.
Thank you for hosting the session.
I'm sorry, you're not audible. Hello, Shaji. Namaste.
Hi, you're muted.
Doesn't happen too often. Enjoy it while it lasts.
Enjoy the mute till it lasts.
Enjoy my viewing muted while it lasts.
Yes.
Sure.
So yeah, we have 4 minutes. If you would want to keep your video off and mute for some time, at 3:59 or 4, we can start. Thank you everyone for joining in. It's 3:58. We'll be starting in the next 2 minutes. Hello, everyone. Thank you once again for joining in. We have with us today Usha Ramanathan. So thank you, Usha once again for agreeing to do this Zoom session with the participants of our Talash program. We have also taken this liberty and extended this invite to the general public. So we have done a outreach apart from the program. So thank you for coming at this short notice. So before we begin, brief about Usha ji. Usha ji is a human rights activist and a legal researcher. She is a guest professor in multiple universities across the world. She has been a relentless campaigner of people's rights, especially working on the Aadhaar issue and the digital space, in which what we see right now is a kind of a colonization that is going on. So I once again welcome Usha ji. And we also have with us Ashwati, who is helping us with this program. So thank you, Ashwati, for joining in. Ashwati, you're on mute.
Oh, yeah. Okay. So thanks, Ushaji, for agreeing for this talk. And we know things are pretty bad across the country. And we were hoping that this sort of conversations or addas, whatever we call them, would be a good space for people to also come together and discuss about also possibilities, because we see state machinery is not necessarily functioning or working properly at various channels, and people going to social media to resort to, like, to figure out relief and other sort of emergencies. And the last 1 week, so social media has been bursting with all sorts of requests for emergency COVID related measures, which we saw in other calamities also, even during Amphan, or even during the Kerala floods, or even during the first COVID uh, scare and the lockdown. It was something that worked quite well, where a lot of us who were apprehensive about also the digital space had to, like, actually give up that apprehension and sort of had to step in, like start a lot of be part of a lot of online groups and share one's phone number or account details, etc., which at some point had worked as the probably the only measure and only relief for a lot of us. So which also brought in a lot of questions for us about what the digital India that was proposed by the state or the corporates, for that matter, vis-a-vis what it has been doing for a lot of us. Even like the other day, 2 days back, I was reading about this one woman who had put out her number for emergency oxygen and medical requirements, and who got dick pictures as response. So one, like, while one can be sad about the and feel helpless about the state of humanity, one can never be lose one can never be suppressed about the predictability of how people also behave in these sort of situation also. So Talash, as Mohammed mentioned, is a program that we thought would bring together a lot of younger people who carry forward questions of social justice and inequality. And in the last 1 year, particularly in the education sector, one has seen how this whole geographical and digital inequality has sort of restricted a lot of people from accessing education also, which is a fundamental right for us also. And being part of, being somebody from Delhi University and with a lot of friends who are teaching in school sector and in college sector, one constantly hears about how difficult it is, it has been, and how helpless they feel when they actually do not have a lot of students who are not just from Kashmir, but across the country, because since the lockdown, a lot of them have gone back to their place. And particularly for younger girls, how the domestic responsibilities have also fallen upon them, taking care of younger siblings or cooking or supporting their mothers in those sort of things, and how attending classes had become an issue. So what does all of these things mean is something that we were thinking about. And Sambhavna has constantly been like, no, we cannot do, digital, we cannot do online courses. We have to have residential ones. But suddenly this last 1 month has thrown open a lot of challenges for us in that sort of a situation. So we thought this could be a very, like a conversation where some things can be put across, and we can open up the conversation also for people to raise some of these questions. So probably, I think Ushaji, you can take around like 30 to 40 minutes to post some of these things, and after that we'll open it up. And over to you, Shana.
Thank you very much. I came with a slightly different agenda, but we can tutor it to fit this too. See, I've been thinking that in the past 20 years, in the past 15 years especially, we've adopted various forms of technology. Many artifacts have entered our lives. Like the mobile phone is an artifact, it's entered our lives. The laptop, every individual walking around with a laptop has become part of the way in which many people live now. And that's being taken for granted and taken as a given. While we acknowledge the absence of it in some places only as a digital divide, but we don't see we see that digital as being a necessary part of our landscape anyway. And it may not be a wrong thing. I just felt that, we've had some of these conversations over these years, and somewhere we are, I think the social media also has a tendency to do this, and increasingly we are getting into this even in political spaces where there are only 2 points of view and there is no nuancing. And we are taking positions, but we are not really interrogating and trying to figure out not just what should not be, but how we should think about things. So I was just thinking that in the first part of this, if I could just say some of the things that have helped me think, and say the kind of thinking that it has helped me do. And then if I'll pose the question even now, before I begin, on what I'm hoping I'll hear something of, that we will discuss something of this at the end of it, which is, the question is this. See, we are not asking for the throwing away of technology. We are not saying technology should not exist. There are technologies and technologies, and this e-technology that has come to stay in our midst now has started off with excitement and is now today, went through a period of anxiety, and now is anxiety plus inevitability. In the sense, we don't know how to do without it at this stage. So this form of technology, what is it? What is the way in which we need to think about this? What do we want it to address? What do we want it to do? What do we think it can do? And what do we think we shouldn't ask it to do? And how do we need to go towards achieving this? So that's what I'm hoping we'll discuss at the end. For instance, if our problem is poverty, then how we think of these technologies in the context of poverty will be very different from if our problem is inefficiency. They're two completely different things. There may be certain amount of overlap, but they do constitute different universes which may meet every once in a while, that's all. So if we can, even while I'm at it in the first round, I promise I will not demand that everyone should apply their minds entirely to what I'm saying, because I'm also hoping that you will do your thinking during that time. So it's okay. Those who've heard me before have heard me. I'm not sure I'm going to be that different today, because thinking, I find, is a slow process. It doesn't come in leaps. So it's not going to be all that different. But if at the end of this, we can try and figure out, see, this idea of digital India is an ambition of a different kind. But if we were to say that technology has a role in dealing with some of the problems that we identify, then how would we think of those technologies? And how would we think of those technologies in relation to the problem that we have? So if we can just think about it. So I'll start off on the way I set off thinking about this whole thing. See, the thing is, technology, like I said, has been there for a very long time. And one of the early books I read on technology, which made me think, I mean, there have been other things which have been there, but which really suddenly made me, wake up and shake myself into consciousness, was a book called The Executioner's Current. I've mentioned this before, but it's this book. It's called The Executioner's Current. It's written by Richard Moran. And the title of this book is Thomas Edison, George Westinghouse, and the Invention of the Electric Chair. For those of us who work on death penalty, the idea that the execution of a person can, by any standard, be cruel and unusual, will not be cruel and unusual, is unacceptable. In the sense, every death, every execution is cruel and it is unusual. So in American law, they are not allowed to impose penalties in a way which will result in something being cruel and unusual. So they have a conflict, a kind of semi-ethical conflict which they have to deal with all the time. So I'm just going to read from the blurb now so that we get an idea. I've said this, but let me say it in the words in which they say it. And actually, this blurb is quite accurate. In 1882, Thomas Edison ushered in the age of electricity when he illuminated Manhattan's financial district with his direct current system. 4 years later, Westinghouse lit up Buffalo with his more efficient alternating current. The two men quickly became locked in a bitter rivalry to control the electrical power industry. Losing ground, Edison set out to persuade the state of New York to use Westinghouse alternating current to execute condemned criminals. Westinghouse fought back, attempting to stop the first electrocution and keep alternating current from becoming the executioner's current. In this meticulously researched account of the horribly botched first electrocution, the battle of the currents, and the ensuing legal struggle, Moran raises disturbing questions about our society's tendency to search for technological solutions to moral problems. It's an extraordinary tale. It's a tale which tells us that the US establishment wrote to Edison and asked him, they were being challenged in the Supreme Court, and they knew that they might lose the battle of hanging people because that is cruel and unusual, and it's difficult to say that it's not. So they wrote to him saying, listen, this electricity that's coming in, if we were to use that in an electric chair, is it possible that it will be so quick and so painless that we can justify this as being, we can explain this as being not cruel and unusual? And Edison first writes back saying, I'm not going to answer this question because I'm opposed to the death penalty. A year later, the administration writes back and tells him, okay, we understand you're opposed to the death penalty, but can you please, we need this help from you. By then, the battle between Westinghouse and Edison has started. And for who will win the commercial battle with electricity, Edison makes a compromise. And he writes back saying, while I'm still opposed to the death penalty and I want nothing to do with this, use alternating current. Because his idea was, if they used alternating current, he would then brand it as the executioner's current, which will kill immediately and promote his product. These are technological solutions that are being talked about, but actually they are severe moral dilemmas. And in that moral dilemma, corporations have often failed because their job is not to be worried about the moral. If you look at the documentary called The Corporation and read the book called The Corporation, which has had a further edition more recently, you'll understand why a corporation will never be looking for the welfare of everybody, but its job is to look after the welfare of its shareholders and to capture market share. So that's the, that is an imagination that I didn't let slip away from me. It couldn't go. It's just too stark. You can't let a thing like this slip away from your mind. And then when these technologies started coming in, you go back and you look at, okay, what is this internet? Who are these people who created the internet? And who are these people who made corporations with this internet? Because the internet itself, it came primarily from DARPA, which is the Defense Research Agency within the US establishment. But there were people working on it. For instance, I think his name is Tim Berners-Lee, who is deeply distressed at the way in which the internet has got privatized. The internet is being used for purposes for which it was never intended. The point about introducing the internet was that everybody would be connected. It would be information technology, and it would help people communicate with each other. Very soon, they have been finding that all of this is crumbling and it's being taken over as private spaces. So the internet space is full of various private spaces, which offer the only doors or gates through which we can enter it. So who are these people and what is it that they do? So in my head at least, one of the things that raises questions is what happened with Y2K. Y2K is one kind of, Y2K is the time at the turn of the millennium where especially Indian companies, Indian tech companies, made it really big. They made a lot of fortunes on that, and we find that they've been able to build on it with a whole host of other factors like which we'll come to, but including the state stepping in, taxation, putting them outside all rules for as long as they wanted, no rules at all which will bind them. So apart from all of that, you also have the Y2K as a kickoff point from where they found themselves making huge amounts of money. Now this Y2K story is interesting because I kept trying to look. I said, somebody must have written a book on the Y2K. After all, it was such a big deal. And honestly, I haven't found any. So if any of you finds one, please just share that information because it is an astonishing period in the history of technology. So you have, for those who are not familiar with what the Y2K problem was, you had, the internet and computerization, which had also started here, for instance, but not in as vast a way as it was happening in Europe and US and in Japan. So computerization had meant that everything was being put on, digitized and computerized. It was all being put onto the computer. So banks were beginning to function like that. Travel was being, all airlines and all of them were using the computers. Nuclear facilities, for instance, were being linked only to a computer. Now, if you look at the bottom of your, laptop or desktop, whatever you're using, you'll find that there is a date. So it says 24/04/2021. At that time, in the 1900s, it would have said 24/04/21. It wouldn't have said 2021. So as the new millennium was drawing near, suddenly, they woke up to a thing saying that, listen, we've not said it's 2021. So when it becomes 2000 and 2001, it may actually slip back and go into 1900 and 1901 rather than 2000 and 2001. So banks, for instance, would find that all the interest that was being calculated, everything would be going in minus because the computer doesn't know that there is a 2000. So they said this has to be set right, otherwise all systems will collapse. And there was huge business for people who would just go and clear this computer glitch that had supposedly arisen. And all systems had to be made compatible with what the millennium required. Now it was over, we crossed the millennium. There was nothing much that happened, neither among those who had changed it, nor among those who hadn't changed it. So like National Geographic records, we don't know if it was one huge bluff. Maybe there was really nothing at all. But whether there was or there was not, we've not had, the very interesting thing about technology is when technology gets into zones of mystery, it never gets investigated. You just pass on and you don't really look back on it. It's okay, it served its purpose. After that, we start with all the other things. So you come, once the Y2K was over and they tried e-commerce at that time, it was called, it went bust. The dot-com bust was another thing in 2002. And then you find that's about the time that e-governance becomes a big thing. Now, one of the very interesting things about the introduction of technology into e-governance is the centralization of all manner of systems. Technology makes possible centralization. It makes it much easier to take information and to be able to watch from a central place. It's like Yuval Noah Harari was saying in a recent conversation, that the big difference between all the earlier technological shifts that have happened in human history and this technological shift, there are two things that he speaks about. One is that it centralizes, like none of the others could. You know, when you had Eastern Europe and you had the Iron Curtain and you had everyone being surveilled, well, you had all of that, but then they really had to work at trying, and which is why there was more suspicion than information at that time. And people worked on suspicion. Today, it would not be such a big deal because they would just be able to get all that information through a centralized process. As we've been seeing, you know, how this collection of information, how much does it allow for people to be seen, monitored, all the rest of it. The second thing he says is artificial intelligence. So when you start having, you know, this is an extraordinary time when we are being told, when all of us are being, see the logic of the way in which technology is being used now, the direction in which technology is being sent. There are multiple logics, but all of them are about us. And we must also, I think, acknowledge that we have contributed to this happening. For instance, corruption. The way in which corruption has got taken into public spaces and public debate has been appropriated by the technology sector to say, oh, people are corrupt, everyone is corrupt, so everyone has to be put under surveillance. Everyone is a potential criminal, and therefore you need to be put under surveillance. This idea of corruption is just one among many tropes that have been created. So the other is that human beings are inefficient. We steal, we have black money, we don't pay our taxes. We are destroying systems. We are actually so we have to be monitored and made to stand, made to do what we are supposed to do by keeping us on track. And to keep us on track, these technologies, these technological uses to which they are put will help keep us on track. But artificial intelligence is really the most extraordinary of all. I keep thinking, and there was a time, if you go back, you'll be able to see Stephen Hawking making this statement that he actually thinks or thought, although thought is permanent, so I suppose he still thinks it wherever he is. So his idea, he was saying, don't do this artificial technology business. It's not good for human beings. It's really bad. I would never advise it. And when you think about it, what is the logic of artificial intelligence? One central logic of artificial intelligence is that natural intelligence is inadequate. That we are not smart enough. We don't have enough intelligence. We can't deal with most situations. We are imprecise, we are inefficient, and we are all the other things, corruption, criminality, whatever you call it. But artificial intelligence will produce these things that human beings cannot. So we need to, in a sense, it's like the birth of a new God because it's superhuman. It takes what human beings have and then makes it into something that's much more than what any human being can ever hope to have. Now, the questions are, of course, twofold. One, is that true? That, does that deal with the problems that we have? Does artificial intelligence deal with those problems? And if you look at, say, a documentary like Coded Bias, which interestingly is directed, was made by, although it's made in the US, it was made by what we would in Madras call a Madura Ponnu. She's a girl who's originally from Madurai and, a woman who's made the film. And it's a very interesting film. And it's also very interesting because you find that it is young people who are getting into these research spaces who suddenly see this. And then, where do they go with it? So the protagonist of this, of Coded Bias, the documentary, is a young student. And as a student, as a Black student, she recognizes that in facial recognition technology, it doesn't seem to be able to recognize black faces. Dark faces, it's not able to recognize, it's not as clear. In fact, she finds that if she shows her face, it's blank. If she puts on the white mask, it suddenly reveals her. So there are extraordinary biases that are built into this. But like they say, although I felt not enough in the film, it's not just about the biases that creates. Would it be okay if it were able to recognize her fully and perfectly? They do say every once in a while there that no, I mean, it should not be doing this at all. But I think we need to keep it in our heads that artificial intelligence is being introduced in our midst by convincing us that our inadequacies will be taken care of by artificial intelligence. And it's not just deeply flawed. And if you look at Cathy O'Neill's Weapons of Math Destruction, you'll find that she gives us many illustrations and many ways of looking at this, many ways of looking at what this artificial intelligence is and why it's a problem. But I think we also need to move beyond and be able to think about what it means when, as human beings, we have lost, we've lost our respect for the earth. We've lost our respect for species, for other species. Today, we are being told that this new God called artificial intelligence is superior to us, and we must surrender ourselves to it. So think about what that means. The other thing is that, in the other area where we've seen technologies come in and where we needed to think about these things in advance, one is just as an illustration, because just to say that technology comes into various kinds of places, when the environment movement started and people were going to court over, many of these environmental issues that we had, the answer to that was found in cleanup technologies. Not in clean technology, but in cleanup technology. If you look at this Bill Gates's latest book on climate, How to Avoid a Climate Disaster, it's a really weird book because it talks like all solutions are with the state and with companies, and the rest of us, we all have to be good bachas and behave properly and do the right thing, and then it'll all be fine. He has no clue because it's a question of who you talk to. So I think it's important for us to figure out who we are thinking of and who we are talking to understand. It's not to tell us how to think, but to help us understand how we need to think about these things. It was very important what you said, Ashwati, about what we've seen during this period of disaster. Every disaster we have found in relation to technologies is an opportunity, provides an opportunity. It's a time of opportunity for various people. So if you look at the kind of things that we've got now, among the things that you said, online education, you find people pushing for online education and work from home. Like we've actually found something that's a miracle cure for all the problems in this world. And we know that that's not true at all, but they are powerful people. So you have e-commerce. E-commerce just has to come to stay. So all our retailers can just figure out how they are going to go or else they just have to vanish. Then Jan Dhan Yojana, that everybody has a bank account. Actually, I think yesterday or day before, there was a Business Standard had an editorial. After all these years of telling us, now it's the 11th, 12th year, but let's say the last 9-10 years, they've been telling us that UID has to be linked up with the NREGA, and then your job card will have the UID number, your bank account will have the job card and UID number, and then the money will just flow into these accounts. After all these years, sorry, can you hear me? Okay, I'm sorry, because the electricity kind of went off, so I wasn't sure.
Yes, we can hear you, yes.
Okay. So if you look at this, they're saying now, after all these years, that the biggest problem that they have in NREGA is delayed payment of wages, no grievance redressal that exists, and non-payment of wages for a long time. People are not able to access their wages. They are having to go and stand for hours before a bank, and then they're not able to get their money still. They don't know whether it's come or not. This is a problem after 12 years. And if you ask them, they'll tell you teething trouble. Now, if human beings have teething trouble for 1.5 years, and technology has teething trouble for over 12 years, what would you consider superior? So, I mean, and now this has become a time, it's a very strange time. You know, a couple of days ago, I was reading R.S. Sharma talking about CoWIN. See, R.S. Sharma, who was the CEO of UIDAI, becomes TRAI chief, before which he goes to Jharkhand because that's his parent cadre and tries to push this whole UID thing, brings the IRIS, into the system, unusable. And then he now becomes the chair of the CoWIN, the where you register and which will give you the appointments and which will let you know, and that's supposed to be their job. 2 days ago, he says, or maybe yesterday, that by April 24th night, that system will be ready. The CoWIN system will be ready for everyone to register with them, and they will, you can upload you can register for vaccination. Then they say, but of course, we can't give you a date or a time, because state governments have to decide that. And state governments are not yet in a position to say that because they don't have vaccine. And vaccine, well, it depends on a whole host of other things. So we are not promising any of that, but everybody come and register. And then we'll figure out what we do with the rest. Every project today is becoming primarily a surveillance project, a project where you have to register yourself, where you have to report to the state. Then the state decides what it wants or does not wish to do with you. So if you take the Social Security Code and the labor laws change that happened recently, there they say that every person who doesn't have a job, so unorganized sector, everyone must register themselves on their portal for them to be entitled to any benefit at all. So if you don't come and register yourself with us, we give you none. There cannot be any other systems in place. We want everyone in one place. And then they tell the employers, you also come and tell us when you have vacancies. Now, it would have made sense, at least in my head, if you match the vacancies with the people who are there and say that, okay, you can get this job and offer it to them to take or not. No. The employers are told, you come, you register, and this is all in the law, I'm not just saying it from my head. You come and register, you tell us what vacancies there are, but that doesn't oblige you to take people from the system at all. So everybody just report. We promise you nothing in return. And with employers, we will not burden you with having to take anyone from the system that we put on offer. You can employ anybody you want. We just want to know who you are and what your vacancies are, and that's it. Absolutely no obligation to the unorganized labor. So this is the imagination that we are seeing today. It's an imagination that has gone to the World Bank. It has gone, if I tell you that the UN, there is an identity kind of committee that's been set up by the UN Secretary General, and the head of that committee is Melinda Gates. I mean, what on earth are we doing? People who have to benefit from this kind of system are being put there to say how you're going to make everyone come onto the system. And this is an imagination by which the whole world, 7.9 billion that you have today, everybody needs to come on to a centralized system which whoever wants to do whatever they want with can watch. In India, we are seeing an interesting phenomenon. It's a very funny phenomenon. I mean, it's one way of looking at it. So I'm just giving you one way of looking at it. It is Silicon Valley versus Koramangala. Actually, it's Silicon Valley versus Infosys, but you can, Infosys is primarily in Koramangala because between Narayan Murthy as head of NPCI and the various things he does, and Nilekani as head of UIDAI and and GSTN and all the rest of it, and what's his name, Chris Gopalakrishnan doing the non-personal data framework and saying how everybody's data should just go on to becoming, their things that they can use to build businesses. It's actually the Infosisification of the state. But broadly, it is Silicon Valley versus Koramangala. I found that fascinating because there's a book that's come out, that came out a while ago. I'm only reading it now, by Ajanta Subramaniam. If any of you's read it, it's just fascinating that it comes at a time like this. She doesn't have in her book, it's a book called Caste That Matters. So it's a book about the IITs. And her fundamental thesis is this, that, you know, when, or the fundamental thesis as I understand it is this, that, you know, there were artisanal castes, there were masons, there were a range of caste of merit. Thank you, Maya. It's caste of merit. Now, what she is fundamentally saying is that you have, you know, you had artisan people who worked with their hands and people who knew how to work with their hands. So artisans were people who did the work. How did that get translated into a knowledge-based thing, where you then go to a college, you learn it, and you never really soil your hands at all? People do civil engineering without ever having touched mud. Now, so how did that happen? And what did caste have to do with it? So it's an extraordinary book, but it also tells us that, you know, it explains, it's actually there for us to see, but I think, you know, whether you're looking at Silicon Valley today or you're looking here, all these guys are IIT chaps, and their imagination goes in a certain direction. They may all be good guys who mean very well. I'm not even going to bother to question any of that, but it is one manner of imagination. And in that imagination, like they'll say, if I can get a DigiLocker in, like for instance, when they were working on DigiLocker, and I met some of the techies who were working on that, you know, on the idea of the DigiLocker. And I asked them, but if you're going to put everything into a DigiLocker and it becomes possible to access that, like if I have to open it out and I don't have a choice after that, I can't say I'll give you, you know, if you're going to make it mandatory for me to be giving all my information, if I'm going to get any service at all, wouldn't that be a problem? Because, you know, why should a person be, you know, why should an employer or somebody who you're buying something from be told that, well, you can ask for whatever information you want, it's all there in their locker and they just have to open it out to you? Why would you even want to think of something like that? Why aren't there better ways by which people can control what, you know, what they are, whatever, you know, if I have to have a CBSE certificate, whatever, if it is possible for me to get it immediately from, you know, because it's all just digital, then make it quicker, make it faster for me to get it from there. Why should everything be clubbed together in one place? And they said, actually, you know what, that's not what we are working on. We are just working on creating the digital law. And I was like, yeah, right. So you know, you have your task, you're all technologists, which means you just produce the tools. You don't think about the ethics of the tool. I think it is important at a time like now to read Ajanta Subramaniam, because she explains to us why that imagination is not something we can go along with. Why, you know, it will not work for almost anyone in this country, as we can see is happening all around us. And so this Silicon Valley versus Koramangala is a interesting battle. One of the ways in which it has got expressed, and if you look at Silicon Valley, who's sitting there? One Satya Nadella, you know, who's gone from here. You have, what's that other young gentleman, Sundar Pichai. They're all of the same ilk. It's just that they're sitting there and doing it. These guys are saying, we want our business. And you are having an advantage because you're in the US where they have no rules for any of this. It's laissez-faire. We have more difficulty, and everybody who's smart has gone there, come back here and work with us. So since they're not able to get that, they tried doing this thing of data localization. Data localization, the whole battle over data localization, in my understanding at least, is companies here saying, or business interests here, which is actually a small group, it's just the Koramangala group, which has been saying, please do not, you know, the group here is saying that we don't want the data from here to go out. We want access to all this data. So why? Because it's not only about the internet and whatever. Actually, they have worked on creating more and more places where this data will emerge. They've worked with the state to make everything mandatory. They've put in place all these, you know, the eKYC and e-sign and everything else, so that they can datafy it. They can datafy people. It is about the datafication of the people. They are worried that if it slips into the US companies will do whatever they want with it. The whole logic of data localization came crashing when Amazon, Facebook, who have you, became partners with Reliance here. And none of the Koramangala gang can really get anywhere into challenging Mukesh Ambani. I mean, that's really difficult even for them to do. So now the entry of Silicon Valley into India has safely, it was always there, but it's safely ensconced itself in Reliance. And they are here now to stay. So it's a game which is being played by players who are competing with each other. But in the process, what is happening with us is something that we need to recognize. So on coming to why, what would this alternative imagine? How do we imagine this? See, in my mind, I think, I know some of you will laugh when I say this, but I think the mobile phone has not been altogether a bad thing. Because when I see sometimes the kind of boredom that an auto rickshaw person, for instance, driver has, and he's sitting there and able to watch something or talk to his family or whatever when he's far away, I'm thinking that, my God, this must really be saving his day, because it's just so painful otherwise to do the kind of work that they do. But that is so long as it is a tool in your control. When that becomes something else, so what has it become? One, it's become a smartphone, it's become a feature phone, and it's become an Arogya Setu app, where you should be tracked. You imagine you have Arogya Setu brought in because you have COVID. And they say that we will be able to track people who are nearby. We might be, and in some places, apparently in Ahmedabad, maybe they managed to use it to a certain extent, and then it just vanished. But today, while the Arogya Setu purpose has lost itself, today you have a judge in the lower courts of Delhi who's giving bail to a person and saying that I give you bail, but you have to download Arogya Setu onto your phone, and you must keep your phone with you all the time. There is no law in India. The Criminal Procedure Code does not permit this kind of surveillance of a person who's been given bail. And we are losing all these basic norms on which we live. If you look at what the mobile phone is today, as one who doesn't have it, I can tell you that it's almost impossible. They make it impossible for you to perform almost any function. So if I go to a bank, the only reason that I get away without having a mobile phone and yet be able to have an account is because, I'm able to pull my weight with them. Otherwise, I would be in serious trouble. If I look at, look at anything, and so it's become a tool of surveillance. What happens today when somebody gets called in for an investigation with the NIA? The first thing that they do is say, leave your phone with us and go. And then they'll say it was voluntarily given with us and gone. The mobile phone today has everything about people. And I think there's a petition pending in the Supreme Court today now saying, some academics and others have gone to the court saying that, listen, our life's work is in these machines. And the moment you walk in, you take away all our machines and you take everything and you go away. You don't have a right to do that. And you don't have a right to have all information about me. Your investigation can only be about what you need to know. You have to come and find out. You can't just do this general, whatever it is that you want. So I'm not going to spend any time on saying what are the kinds of things that we've had. If you look at FASTag, it's just become a surveillance tool. Today, and unfortunately, when I say Koramangala and I say Infosys, this first report on the toll collection and making it, bringing it up to this point has all been Mr. Nilekani's doing. GSTN. Again, Mr. Nilekani chairs that committee. And today it's sitting with Infosys. Infosys is making a load of money on that, but it's a completely, I was completely stunned when chartered accountants became agitational. I'm like, hello, you are the, most good guys who just sit there and we don't even hear your voices otherwise. And suddenly they were agitating, saying that this darn GSTN, the network, the kind of system that you have is making it impossible for us to work. There is no answerability. Income tax. So one of the interesting things that's happened is that they said you should link it up with, you should link your UID with PAN card. Plainly, many people are not doing it or they're not able to do it. Very often it's also because you're not able to do it. And you find that now they kept saying we'll defer it. Now they realize that they're beginning to look foolish by deferring so much. So they said we'll cancel it earlier. Now they've said, no, you'll pay 1,000 rupee fine. So because if they cancel, they lose out. taxing will become a problem. So it's a strange way in which health ID, talking about a health, how many more IDs, I don't know. DigiLocker, mobile phone, RFP, so you can go on like this. So when we are thinking about another imagination, one of the things to do is also to look at, see, there's a book called Geek Heresy. Now, if you look at this book, it's, he was a Microsoft guy who came here, who was told that, you must, like Bill Gates writes even in his climate book, that they planned that there should be, every desk should have a desktop on it. So the idea was to take computers to every person. And in writing about what he saw when he went there, I mean, obviously he's not a good guy for them anymore. He writes about this thing called amplification. He says it's not like technology will solve the problem. It's not like technology can produce things which will help in solving the problem. What technology does is amplify what is on the ground. If I am literate and I have certain kind of skills, I can operate things to a certain extent. So every person, they say, oh, everyone is able to talk on the mobile phone and everyone is able to send messages. Possibly. But you have no means for many people, they wouldn't know how they give consent or don't. You see the number of people who are losing money because it's become cashless and people call and ask, and nobody knows when you're supposed to speak and when not, when do you give your password and when you don't. So financial literacy, which was a central part of financial inclusion, has got ousted. And what you have is just bank accounts, and then it goes from there to wherever it goes. So what he says is, you have to see what is on the ground, and what is on the ground merely gets amplified. Don't look for it. Don't look for technology as a solution. So I was thinking, what is it that we wanted addressed, and what is it that when they had these ID projects and all the rest of it, what is it that they said they would be addressing to have it, to have resolutions? Poverty.
Sorry, if I may interrupt.
Yeah, I'm done.
No, you can take like maybe 3 to 5 more minutes. Like if we were in real conversation, I would pass a chit, I guess. But now since that, I would have passed a chit saying that 5 more minutes, because that is not happening right now. I guess I'll have to like stop you and alert you.
No. Actually, I'm nearly done, because this 3-4 things that I'm going to say are starting off of the conversation.
Okay.
So this is the way this is what we've seen. I mean, there is a whole load. One can go on with all of this. But now I'm saying, what is it therefore that we need? What is it that we are looking for? Anything that is, that is around us. What is it that we are looking for it to produce answers for, or to improve our situation? Hunger, poverty, inequality. I mean, you look at the way inequality has been growing, and get that these technologies are producing people of such wealth that they become philanthropists, and then they decide what kind of agenda should be set. If we as a people have to move away from that and learn to do our own thinking, we need to figure out in each of these, or take climate change. I mean, the Bill Gates book is like I couldn't but laugh when I read the book, because, here we are saying that go to people who've been living close to nature, figure out what it is that you can't say, let's make zero whatever cement and then build the same kind of structures that we've been building. It's bizarre. So if these are our problems, then how do we think about technology as providing us with a way, how do we want technology to be? What kind of artifacts will work? What kind of norms should be set in place? What should be the rules by which technology is controlled, so that it's not people who are controlled, but technologies? And importantly, if we believe that civil liberties, freedom, if these inchoate but deeply experienced phenomena are to continue to be and to get enhanced over time, if we want to improve the record on this, then what should technology be? Where would we want it to go? Because without thinking of an alternative imagination, we may become good critics of what has happened so far. But it might be, again, it may, especially given that so many people have adopted, whether it is social media or whatever. I mean, I find social media something that where you should practice non-cooperation, but we'll discuss that as we go along. So if you can Ashwati, if you can help in, getting together a conversation which will help us push our thinking on what we want with technology and what do we think is technology that should be in our midst.
Thanks a lot, Usha. I think it has opened up a lot of questions in terms of how you've summarized the history of digitization of all sorts of sectors, starting from like medical to education to like welfare schemes to employment to finance also, which we have seen in the last 4 years, how there's been a complete shift, not just starting from demonetization, but that has sort of pushed a lot of us towards that, I think, towards digitization, and where even small towns like have moved to like things like Google Pay and Paytm. There is no other option, where ATMs are constantly short of money and all of those things. And with the lockdown, how education and employment have moved to digital space, and availing of welfare schemes, particularly with UID, has moved. And I think that is something that is very important also. And particularly for the younger generation, I think in the last, a lot of activism space has been through social media also. In the beginning of this year, when this whole draft EIA was proposed, I think it was through social media, because all of us were in a lockdown at that point. And I think it was through very, very active social media intervention that there was a lot of outrage and like response about and information about what this new draft EIA meant. And we saw a lot of younger people getting involved in social media. And when that sort of extended to UAPA on some of these groups, what did that conversation sort of generate when, and that also extends to something that you pointed out at this point about seizing of one's personal laptop or hard disk. And I remember Hani Babu, one of the professors and friend from Delhi University, who's still incarcerated for the Bhima Koregaon case. And one of the things that he had demanded at that point was that everyone whose equipment gets seized be allowed to make a copy of their hard disk or content of their data before it gets seized by the NIA or the authorities for that matter. But that also is not something that is provided by the state. So anything can be inserted at any point of time through digital or other spaces as well. So I think we can sort of open up the conversation. It'll be nice if people can in the chat box, write down any questions that they have, or if they can raise hands, I can point it, because it's a small group, I don't think we will need to write down the questions and then ask. But if people want to ask, they can just use the raised hand emoticon and we can direct them to you. Or Mohammed, do you want to start? By then people can start formulating questions.
Yes, thank you, Ashwati. So what I wanted from Ushaji, if you could just update us on the whole Aadhaar project and where it is going right now and some of the latest developments.
Should I wait and say it after others have intervened? Or?
Yeah, we could wait for others.
Yeah.
I had a quick question, but I can't see the raise hand function. So
that's okay.
It's okay,
Oh,
Maya.
please go ahead. Please go ahead.
Okay, just a brief question. Can you say something about how these payments, what is the business model of these payment platforms like Paytm and Google Pay? That's all.
Okay, thanks, Maya. I think maybe, Usha, we can start with these couple of questions, and then by then people can either write down their questions on chat box or they can raise hands. If it doesn't work, just unmute and ask the question. That's also perfectly fine, I guess.
Okay, so what is the status of the UID project now? See, it's sorry, 1 second. It's come to stay according to them. According to the project and its authorities, it has come to stay. And so now with all its glitches and whatever problems there are and whatever, it will continue. Now you'll notice that there has been very little expansion of the use of iris as for identification, for verification, hardly used at all. And fingerprints are primarily being used where the poor are involved. So whether it is PDS or NREG or whatever, that's where they use it. Otherwise, it's not like fingerprint is being used in a big way. Both these were started without having trying them anywhere. So they failed. Basically, they say that we managed to use them to get everyone onto our database. But when it comes to your authenticating yourself, saying that this is who you are, in many of these cases, it just doesn't work. So you'll see that there is a case pending in the Supreme Court now, where if you remember the first time it was known that a child had died because she couldn't get, the family couldn't get food because they were not able to link up with the ration card. They couldn't link the UID with the ration card. So they didn't get food and the child died. Now, I think a case has gone from Jharkhand to the Supreme Court, where they're saying pay compensation to that family. I mean, this project killed the child. And so that petition is pending, where one of the statements that's been made is that about 3 crore people have lost their ration cards, a large number of them because of the problems that UID has created. What is important about this is that it has not changed the project at all. Project continues. So if you really want to see, I can send you a thing later, where Nilekani is in an interview with Veer Sanghvi, where when he's asked, multiple times, one child dies, it doesn't matter, one child dies, it doesn't matter. Finally, he says, on balance, yes. Which is to say that the project should carry on, because on balance, okay, maybe a child died here and there, but on balance, yes. So that's the nature of the project. And you find that, so if you ask what is the status of the project, in terms of it having become part of the establishment, it has become part of the establishment. But in terms of the project itself and how it's rolling out, there are a whole host of problems that have begun to show. If you look at what Ram Sevak Sharma has done sitting in Kovan and starting experimenting in Jharkhand with facial recognition for vaccination, the explanation that's given is, we are not asking them to put fingerprint, because fingerprint will be touching a surface. But facial recognition we can do. And they're saying we're not doing facial recognition, we're just doing verification. Linking it up, we're just checking it against what already existed on the database from UID. But the truth is that after 11 years, that photograph is not going to work. It's not worked anywhere, it's not going to work here. So my understanding, I could be wrong, but my understanding, using this to see if it is possible to upload photographs again, to replace what existed before or to update what existed before. This is a great opportunity. You tell everyone, you get a vaccination, you have to do this, it becomes an opportunity to, so again, which is why when you say status of the project, the status, when we look at it, is different from how the UIDAI looks at it and how the state looks at it. So it is there, but it's become one more system. The coercion continues, mandatoriness continues, its use continues, but it actually is just one more system, which is why one more health ID, one more FASTag, one more everything. Yeah. On the business model of Paytm, I know Maya's done this to, test me, and I may fail this test. But as far as I understand, and I'm not going to stretch it to things that I don't know, but as far as I understand, one of the reasons that cashless has become such a big deal is because of the digital footprints that you leave. And that digital footprint then becomes data. And that then can be monetized, this data. But immediately, the advantage that this kind of, the Paytm kind of thing, immediately what you find, and this is this has been talked about for a long time, is about creating a float. So what happens is your 10,000 rupees of yours will be put into their, you leave it with Paytm. You will then draw from it. There is no interest. You're not going to be paid any interest on it. You can just use it to pay in different places. And the moment the money starts coming to an end, you put in some more money. So the company continues to have a float which it can then use in various kinds of ways. This keeping of the float is also something that's significant when they say everything should come through a bank. And when they say, now let's convert all of that into cashless, because cash is one way in which the float vanishes for them to the extent that there is cash. So this is a way of giving free money and leaving it with these companies, which then they can use for their other, all money left in different places gets used as investment. So, and especially with these companies where they do not, even a bank pays you, even if it's a small amount, they pay you an interest. These payment companies do not pay you any interest. So think about what it would mean if every day somebody will keep giving you more and more and more money, and you have to give it back to them in driblets. And you can then use there's a constant amount of money there because people need to leave that money with you. That's the kind of implication that I can clearly see. What else there is, as time passes, we'll learn.
Thanks, Usha. I think this on balance argument is something that has come from the authorities also at various points, particularly during demonetization. Also, we saw that constantly like coming back with the number of deaths that were happening, and even in the welfare schemes, the availing of the welfare schemes when children were dying. This was something that kept coming back. So I think I remember in that one public meeting that we had right after demonetization at Constitution Club, one of the things that you spoke about was also this disruption technique that gets implemented. So at some point, if you can also talk a bit about that, and probably what is happening right now is also something similar with regard to the healthcare system also, because currently I'm also part of these helplines for coordinating medicine and other emergency requirement for friends in Delhi. And one of the messages that came to me when constantly we are hearing about the dearth of oxygen in the city was about how friends were able to procure oxygen in black, which means they are available, right? So what is happening, and what is this whole chaos that is is it like actually there? Is it being created for, or are the, clearly the point, the focus for the state is elsewhere, but then at what cost? So before going into that, probably we can take because a couple of questions have come. Rohan, who is also a participant of Talash, has sent a question like to me personally. So
Hello, Ashwati, I think you're stuck.
Yeah, I think Rajita wanted to ask a question, so maybe she can just ask it now. I'll answer that, and then Shashwati can come in.
Yeah, thank you, Usha. So actually, I wanted to ask about the Jan Dhan. Actually, this idea, generally, whenever we talk about Jan Dhan, the idea is that it is for people who are below poverty line or people who are in need. But as such, if you look at Jan Dhan website, it doesn't say that it is only for BPL. It just says if you don't have another account, you can actually open a Jan Dhan account, giving these documents, whatever. So right now, with this cash transfer of 500 or whatever during pandemic and everything going into accounts, people who are in need, I mean, the small study that I did, people who are in need actually don't have a Jan Dhan account. And there are many people I came across who are pretty much well off, who have Jan Dhan accounts. And I think Anupam shared with me RTI, this thing, wherein they said that there's no information as to who has account and what accounts Jan Dhan has. I mean, there's no actual information available. But I don't have anything much about it. Can you just explain about this Jan Dhan thing a bit?
Yeah, so you go back to 2010 and you'll find that in an interview, Nilekani says that there are, the roti kapda or makan is now passe. I mean, I've said it so many times, I feel like I'm waking up in my sleep and saying it. Roti kapda or makan is now passe. It is now mobile phone, bank account, and UID, the three numbers that people will need. So this is what everything will bank on, because the idea is to shift everything to DBT, and anything that anybody is entitled to from the state will, you become a beneficiary. It's like the state is giving you largesse. So you have that account and it will be put into that account. And we've seen how the idea of that account has been used over this period of time. And you've seen how Mamta Banerjee, for instance, said, farmers, if you want to give farmers money, give it to the state government, we'll give it to our farmers. Who are you to give it directly into those accounts? But it becomes one way of reaching money. I mean, we know that elections are run on things like this. So reaching money to people directly and saying, I gave it to you. So that's one of the main objectives of this. But if you look at the Aadhaar Act and look at Section 5, that's an interesting section because it says that for people it talks about people who would otherwise find it difficult to get onto the system. They will make special provisions to help them get onto the system. So it's persons with disability, persons who are too old, who are, tribal communities, whatever, very poor people. So all of them are bunched together in that, and they say these people will give special dispensation. But actually what you found over this period of time is, and which is why when they started, they said in the first few forms, for the first few years, you would find that the form would say, do you have a bank account? In that form, in the UID form. And there used to be a banker who will be sitting there, a banker's representative, who will then automatically link it up with that and give you a bank account. So if you had so it went through many phases. So one of those phases, they said, if you have a bank account, put your bank account number. Because if you don't put a bank account number, we'll automatically give you another number. And there were many people who went through this time without knowing that they had an account, but the account had been given to them. And then there is a whole, it's complex because it goes on. If it's not operated for a certain period of time, then suddenly you owe it money. Earlier, they would just shut it down. Now you owe it money. And then they said these are no-frills accounts. No-frills accounts did not require KYC. Now, because the UID wants that the no-frills accounts should be through the UID, they say, no, use this as the KYC. So it's been, that's been the story. So the story really is that they were looking from the beginning at fintech as being one of the primary uses for a business model through UID. And that you'll find in the 2010 document, the strategy overview document. The last part of the document is about what they call financial inclusion. But since financial inclusion, like I said, is primarily, first of all, it is about financial literacy, and then it's about credit. And neither of these was a part of that project. It was about fintech companies being able to come in. Fintech companies have an interest that they want to be able, which is why now they say cashless, paperless, presenceless. I don't care who you are, where you are. I need to see your digital footprints. I need to see your banking, where you spend, what you do, where you have that money. I need visibility of that. Then I will decide whether to give you credit or not. This is the new game. And that game really hasn't taken off very well. They would like to believe that it has. It's actually not taken off very well, partly because it was so shoddily done that many people, the people that you say they do not have a Jan Dhan account, maybe they do. They just don't know it. So it's so when you look at Section 5 and you look at Jan Dhan accounts, there was meant to be a congruity between these two. But the main interest of the project was to get as many people as possible, as quickly as possible onto the system, onto the database. That has resulted in what you can see today, that people don't know if they are there, people don't know if they have something. And somebody like me who doesn't have a mobile phone is hesitant, even like I need this, but anyway, it's hesitant to get onto the UID system, because if my fingerprint stops working and my biometric stops working, the only way that I can update it is by getting an OTP to a registered mobile phone number. So what about those who don't have mobile phones? What about those who gave some wrong numbers in the beginning because they thought you had to give some number? So koi dukandar ka, koi kisi ka, they just put the thing in. Now you don't know what those numbers are, and you can't change it unless you have access to that number. So this is partly an answer to your question to Mohammed, that many of these are things which are about a shoddily done project. I don't know that this project would have been greatly done because biometrics is a disaster. But even beyond that, the hurry with which it was done has meant, I don't know if you've seen, recently there was a Poshak Gyan. There was one document, one press release from the government. Mm-hmm. Now everything is about behavioral change among people. And Poshak Gyan was the most bizarre for me. So when it comes to COVID, it is not Kumbh Mela, it is not, it's not election rallies, it is people's behavior. This is not to say that, we shouldn't be careful or whatever, but it's like complete deflection from that. So they are saying the problem is behavioral. In Poshak Gyan, they're saying that there is malnourishment. Malnutrition is happening at the same time that you have so much food stocks. So this is a behavioral problem of the people. So we, we've kind
Not
of
access. Not
so
access to food.
we just need to see what are the ways in which the narratives, technology is also allowing these narratives to come in.
True. I just wanted to add one point regarding the Paytm and this. Would it be possible that they would start charging for every transaction some percentage amount? Like for cash, it's free, but as it grows, as the system grows, at one point in time in future, one is advertisement revenue probably from Google Pay and all, but
No, actually, it's already there. See, they've been having this merchant discount rates. Every time you do a transaction, there is supposed to be an amount that gets cut, and everyone gets one little share of it. The government has been pushing against it and not allowing those charges to yet come in because the government wants everyone to go cashless. So first you have to take people onto that platform, burn what existed before, then you can start charging people whatever you want. It's the same. I mean, it's a business model. It's not, the government is also following only a business model. So it will happen. You're right. I mean, there will be, it's like it happened with ATMs, no? You started, you could just take and you could go. Now they say, no, if you have so many, then I'm going to take 25 rupees from you. If it's so much more, I'll take so much more.
Metro
and nobody asks you, and there are no rules. It's just decided.
Yeah, Metro ATMs, non-Metro ATMs, different charges and so on.
Correct.
Yeah, Vineet has asked a question along back on the chat. With the Arogya Setu app, what would be the purpose to develop such an app since assuming that there are very little penetration in rural or remote areas, how does this link to the health stack? So one is assuming that there may not be a penetration in rural or remote areas for Arogya Setu. And even as we know, not everyone has a mobile phone. So what was the purpose behind this Arogya Setu? That's one.
Actually, if you, both the health stack and this, if you look at all these projects that have come, various kinds of projects which are gathering data about people, it's about datafication. It's about getting it from whatever source you can get, which is why I'm saying that Arogya Setu was in large measure a disaster opportunity, an opportunity which disaster provided. So put people onto it, coerce people to get on. The thing about India has been that ruleless coercion, which is pushed by business interest, which then shares the abilities that are created for collecting data, for knowing about people with the state. This has been the model. And so Arogya Setu is part of that model. It fits in very well with that, which is why you collect all that, maybe somebody uses it and then you forget about it, but the data remains. And like I'm saying, function creep happens. You can use it for anything after that, no? There are no rules to prevent you from using it for anything.
True.
And the health stack is also part of this. I mean, health stack is about getting whatever they can. I'm not going to talk about this, but I'm just going to say that I've said it somewhere else, which is on eminent domain and how our data has become the latest resource, which the state is saying is the state's resource, and which therefore it will allow people, various kinds of people, to convert into something that will contribute to the economy. So there is land, there is water, there is minerals, and there's our data. And our data is in that same place today. So we need to understand what the politics of eminent domain is.
I've just shared the link of a webinar that happened yesterday, which was organized by Center for Financial Accountability on how something that you mentioned right now about bank charges and what is the legalized way in which they are looting people's savings. It will be a good reference for probably those interested to listen to after this conversation.
Right.
Rohan had sent a question. He didn't want to ask it, so I'll just read it out. This is regarding something you mentioned about financial literacy and it being completely lost, more so in the grassroots space because of technology. What steps can be taken to start people getting oriented to this again, now that we have to live with technology?
Okay, I'm not going to answer that question because I don't think defeatism is the way to begin. And I don't think, sometimes people say, oh, it's already happened. And I'm like, many things have already happened. We left the medieval ages behind, no? Why should we think that we'll have to carry the medieval ages with us forever? So I think if we think it's a problem, we need to think about ways of addressing the problem and not accepting the problem. So I mean, I'm going to do a pass on that one and say, let's come back to think about what it is. Huh?
You're taking the Edison route.
I'm not taking the Edison route. Don't you dare.
Ashati, you want to come back to the chat, and Brinda has a question. So this is
Yeah, if Brinda wants, she can just unmute and ask also if she's comfortable with that. Otherwise, you can just read out the question. I had lost it because.
Hi, Usha. My question to you was regarding cryptocurrency. How cryptocurrency, and there's just like rampant, suddenly, it's just so hard to catch up with all that's going on there. How all that ties into, surveillance one. I understand it has something there to do with the cashless framework of it and presenceless framework as well. But how does that tie into this whole thing of surveillance and welfare state, right? It's still hard to, because for me, ultimately, I'm looking at understanding how this is going to impact people. Again, say your people who are eligible for a Jandan or state welfare, how is that going to tie into that narrative? So, yeah, if you have any thoughts on that.
Thank you for saying if you have any thoughts and not asking for an answer. Because I'm not muted, am I?
No, you're not.
Okay.
We can hear you.
Okay, so cryptocurrency, my understanding is slightly different of cryptocurrency. I think the logic of it is that it is people saying that everything can't be controlled by the state. It's challenging the idea of the state having, if we look at many of the historical moments in India's journey, for instance, take Kashmir. We'll say that at the beginning, when there was that agreement, when the treaty was signed, currency was still allowed with the Indian state. So every time the state retains like foreign relations and currency and a few other defense and things like that. So the idea of currency being under the control of the state is, it's almost like something that you wouldn't even know how to ask questions of it. And then along comes cryptocurrency to say that you don't create the currency, you don't control it, and I don't engage through you. So it's not going to be controlled by the dollar. It's not going to be visible for you to take and do what you want. But ultimately, that's the interesting part. I mean, as a concept, it's a fascinating concept. As something that's real, I wonder what all this means, because from what I read, I find that cryptocurrency, the production and maintaining all these transactions requires a huge amount of energy. It's like so energy consuming, and that whole blockchain business is so energy consuming that when they say that technology is very clean and it doesn't take anything, that's rubbish, because it actually requires an extraordinary amount of energy. So in fact, that was one of the chilling moments in when I was looking at this, which also I've talked about earlier, but that Institute of Human Obsolescence, where they say all these cryptocurrencies, blockchain, all of this requires so much energy that labor today, which is becoming redundant because of artificial intelligence, will have to find, because many things are falling by the wayside, will now become labor that the labor that we'll provide will be producing heat, bodily heat, which will then be what we, that will be our manual production. So that's what cryptocurrency and blockchain represent for me. I'm not sure that blockchain has been sufficiently tested and that it's passed. It's something that the World Economic Forum decided that they would push. Again, as an idea, it's a very interesting idea that you can't overwrite, and you have to keep building on it so that and that it is not controlled by any, that the truth is not controlled by any one person, but that it is federated. As an idea, it's fascinating. But in terms of its practicability and what it will do to people in relation to this kind of data, I think it will still occupy at best a niche and not go beyond that. Now, of course, we know that they are all looking at engaging with states and allowing for ATMs, Bitcoin ATMs and what have you. So there is a hybridization that's kind of happening. It's still in process. So I don't really know. I think only people who have a lot of money in excess can experiment with this, because you never know if it's going to survive or not and what it means. We know that cash itself, after demonetization, we know that I can have cash in my hand and it can have no value, because it depends on somebody else accepting that it has value, and no contract and no promise and no state can be depended upon to retain, to help retain its value. So that much we know. I think yes, that's, as I understand it, that's where we are.
I'm going to take now this as a chance to also ask Mohammed. I think I think Sambhavana should actually organize a talk or like a conversation on cryptocurrency and blockchain as well, because if you look at with your national AI strategy, and Tamil Nadu is already out with a Tamil Nadu blockchain policy, in fact. So it's like essentially they're doing a lot of work in terms of, I don't think the people who put together the policy even know anything about blockchain. It sounds like it reads like a tender, honestly, for businesses. It doesn't read like a policy document at all. You should look at it. I mean, and I wonder if people who actually have written this have understand blockchain for themselves, even to be honest, and it's an experiment. And which is also why I think we should be like, it would be great if you could like organize a conversation,
Sure.
a talk with someone who can actually break down that technology for us to understand it even, right? Like to even imagine if it can have any kind of implication, or what are the kinds of implication it can have.
We're going to ask Usha ji to do some research for the next 6 months. And then
Yes,
Well, I do have a book called Blockchain for Dummies, and I feel dummy enough reading it. So sure.
Okay, definitely. But yeah, we'll take in that suggestion. Moving on to Trishti, she has also the same question on Bitcoin. Probably you've answered it or you have given your thoughts. But the other question that she's asking is, what way do you think people who have already linked into the Aadhaar can get out of the system? You've answered this many times before, but Trishti's.
See, the first thing is, don't use it. It may be used on you, but don't use it. It's a deeply faulty system. If people ask you for it, you don't have it. Just don't use it. The one way of making something die away is by not paying attention to it. They do that to us all the time. So we should know. I mean, we know what that implication is. Second thing is that actually, see, the thing is, none of the system hasn't been audited at all. I don't really know in what way this is working, because if you look, I go back to a 2011 report where they said, when they were talking about these 5, GSTN and all the rest of income tax and excise, and they say, we understand the problem. It's a Nilekani committee report. And they say, we understand the problem of garbage in, garbage out. So if all kinds of rubbish is put into the system, of course, you'll only get rubbish. So how do you deal with it? Because when people come in and register with you, they may just be putting things like when the UID system got created, right? Then they say that we have dealt with it in the UID AI by making it into a self-cleaning process, which means that you yourself will have to go and clean it and make sure that your data is fine and do all that you need to make it accurate. Because if you don't do it, you will lose. Since it was meant to be ubiquitous, mandatory, and you cannot operate without it, it becomes imperative for you to go and clean up in the system. Never mind how difficult it is, that's your job. You better go and do it, otherwise you'll just fall off. Now that process of saying, there are so many, I remember when ration cards were there, when I first moved to Delhi, everybody had to have a ration card. That was our only ID, and it was also, if I needed a, rental agreement, I needed a ration card. So all of us got us. Then after some time, the ration card became redundant for most people, and it just dropped off. We never went and cancelled it anywhere. Then later they called that duplicate and fraud and ghost and what have you. But actually, who goes to cancel an ID unless you want to replace it with something? So you had all these, I think some, it's what's the legal term that they use for it? Right. It's called desuetude. We can never say things simply. So it is DESUETUDE, which basically means falling into disuse. We all have to assist the UID to fall into disuse. Our norm and our principle should be this, terribly uncomplicated word called desuetude. That's what I would recommend.
Yes. Usha ji, I think we have one last time for one last question. I think you've already answered. I'll read it.
I think I just have a very curious question for Usha, which is like something that will be of interest to a lot of people. Like you mentioned, you function without a mobile phone and you have been for a while now. How has the past year and a half, or maybe like the last 2 years been, and what are the tips that you would give for people who do not necessarily want to? Because for people who have you been using digital space also, there has been a lot of exhaustion and anxiety also that is created, who are using probably those spaces in a proactive way as well. So just like, from personal experience, if you could share a bit about that also, it'll be great to hear about that.
I'll start with something slightly different, which is on non-cooperation, like I said before. We had a discussion yesterday or day before, yesterday in another forum. And this thing of social media, everyone has to have everything on social media. There's an anxiety if you're not there. There's an anxiety that you don't know as soon as the other person knows. I think the first thing to do is to be a little real in our lives and say, what is it that I simply have to know immediately and what can wait till tomorrow morning? I think most of us will find that about 102% of what we have can wait till tomorrow morning. So it doesn't really matter. I read the newspapers and find out, and then I'm like, you didn't know. And I'm like, yeah, I didn't know last night. I know today. It's okay. So first thing is to get rid of that anxiety. The second thing is, see, at one time, I also say to some people that just get off this medium altogether. It's a nasty medium. It's toxic. It's spoiling, it's really affecting. I can see how when I have conversations with people, I can see how badly it's affecting people's minds. It's creating two bubbles and then people are sitting with that and throwing stones at each other. I just don't see the point in that. What I do see a point in, however, is, for instance, when there is a rape of a Dalit, or there is, Una kind of thing that happens, or there is a, beef episode that comes in, and somebody, like it happened with George Floyd, the fact that there was somebody there who was not of the police and who had a camera on their phone and recorded the whole thing and then put it up on social media. I think social media is excellent for things like that. Now, the companies don't want you to use it like this. I think we should never lose sight of this, that social media belongs to companies who are using it for multiple purposes. You are their, you are their labor and you are their product. And you cannot, I don't think anyone who has consciousness should allow themselves to be used like this. So use it like a tool. Don't become, don't succumb to it. There's a big difference. And I know that it is difficult. And I also know that, when you see Social Dilemma, for instance, where they tell you how they get people hooked onto it, it is a process of hypnotizing. And it is about finding that moment where you do this and you come out of the hypnosis. It is really important to do that. I mean, as far as I can see. But doing without a mobile phone, if I can be honest with you, I think you'd be much happier without it. I've missed nothing. I've done everything that I wanted to do. I've walked when I wanted to walk. I've traveled by car from here to a friend in Howrah and come back. And not had a problem. What I needed to do, however, was to get detailed instructions before I left home. People have stopped doing that. People have started depending upon every moment. There is no planning ahead. There is no, if you do that, you don't need this. So it's a question of balancing it out. I'm not saying there's something superior about planning in advance. I'm just saying that if you want to make the phone dispensable, whether you dispense with it or not, people lived before, people traveled before, and people did many things before and spent time and their mind on things that were happening around. You're forgetting what it's like. So give yourself a chance. Give yourself a month when you get off it. And then go back to the extent that you want to use it. Don't get caught up in it. These companies are just playing with your mind. I mean, Social Dilemma, the funny part for me was at the end, where you have all these, the good guys from tech who were coming out and saying, oh, we did these terrible things and we realized they are very bad. And then this too I've said before, but I just have to say it, where at the end they say, so what do you suggest we do? And this really cool guy, I mean, he's like quite a dude in this field. He says, just don't accept any notifications. And I'm like, really, that's your solution to a problem that you've created like this, which is of monumental dimensions? So, I think it's important to recognize that your mind is being played with. You don't need this like a tool all the time. You don't need to, everyone walks with one hand occupied by the phone. People don't have two hands anymore. I don't see the sense in it, quite honestly.
I think that is a good point to like wrap up this conversation. Sameer Panda has in fact asked about how people's movement and how to like create more understanding about the Aadhaar. I think probably that can be a conversation for another talk with maybe we can have friends from Mazdoor Kisan Shakti Sangathan, Rajasthan. But Usha, if you want to add something on that regard, we can maybe take a couple of minutes.
Yeah, just this, that, when the problem with the UID was first discussed, it was difficult for people to imagine how it would affect other people, how it would affect various classes of people and what it would do. So it was difficult for people who were, for instance, working in the Right to Food movement or working on various kinds of movements to integrate it into the understanding of their work. But I think that changed a while ago. And in fact, the Right to Food movement was among the first which quickly saw that it could become a problem. What I think we've not done sufficiently, and it's beginning to happen now, is that, some of these systems are not just to be contested. They are illegitimate and they have to be delegitimized. When there are movements and when there are collectives who are addressing a situation like this, I think it is important to sit together and figure out what delegitimizing this means. For instance, I think the case that has gone to the Supreme Court, we've been saying for some time now that you can't have a program killing people and then say that, collateral damage. You have to have an acknowledgement of what that is. And I think that's a very good move that's happened now of taking the matter. I just wish it hadn't gone directly to the Supreme Court, but that's okay. I mean, whatever. So at least it's gone, it's moved there. And it's important that, so I think movements are thinking well, and that the engagement with the problems that this is producing is good. We just have to get a little, more collectivized on trying to think through what delegitimizing this would mean. Because, and I'm saying this not only because of what it is doing to us here, but because India is exporting this model to many other countries. And we actually owe it to them not to allow it to happen. We've seen it already. We don't need them to experience it.
I think for me, 3 pointers from this whole conversation is about non-cooperation, delegitimization, and let things die a natural death, like let them go obsolete. I think these are the 3 mottos that we can take from Usha's talk today to a lot of, like struggles that we are having with, or the perils of digital India for that matter. I think it has also opened up a lot of pointers to further conversations that we can have. Like Brinda suggested, or Sumit questioned about like grassroots movements and how they have responded to Aadhaar. I think is definitely another weekend adda that we can plan, Mohammed, I think. So Mohammed, you want to wind up?
Yeah, thank you, Ashwati. You gave 3 pointers. I think there are 2 more. One is try to dispense with your mobile phone. And at the same time, how do you use social media as a tool rather than being the labor or the product of it? So I think there are many, many other pointers that the participants would have got from such a wonderful talk with Ushaji, and especially the books and the different resources that you have suggested. I think not everyone has seen all the movies, so we'll definitely also have a chance to continue this conversation and look at all those resources. So thank you so much, Ushaji. I just wanted to let you know that it has been a very wonderful, and hopefully we'll be able to continue this with the participants over here. So one last request, if people want to leave their email IDs whom we have reached here via different social media, we would be in touch with you for future talks.
Great. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Yeah, Mohammed.
Yes.
Just a minute. अब्दुल, आप हो क्या यहाँ पे?
Abdul is.
अब्दुल, आप सुन रहे हो? आप अनम्यूट कर सकते हो वैसे. Okay. So basically you can put, if you click on the participant